Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a plunge into some really fascinating source material one of you shared. It's a detailed analysis of the 2021 movie Nobody.
Yeah, Nobody. It looks, very much like a straight-up action flick on the surface.
Totally. You've got Bob Odenkirk.
Yeah.
That Bob Odenkirk from Better Call Saul playing the suburban dad who suddenly just explodes.
Right. Alongside Connie Nielsen, Aleksei Serebryakov, RZA, Christopher Lloyd. Quite the cast.
Exactly. And you might just think, okay, cool fights, lots of action, standard stuff, maybe.
But this analysis we're looking at, it suggests there's, quite a bit more going on underneath all the bullets and car chases.
That's our mission today. We want to unpack how this source dissects Nobody not just as an action movie, but as, surprisingly, a rich character study.
Packed with themes, yeah. Things that kind of stick with you.
So by the end of this deep dive, you'll get a really clear picture of what this analysis finds so compelling about the film's hidden depths. Okay, let's unpack this.
So what's really striking right from the start is how this analysis frames the movie. It doesn't just say, oh, it's about a retired killer pulled back in. No, it specifically calls it a stylized character study camouflaged in bullet casings.
That's a great phrase, camouflaged in bullet casings. It immediately tells you, okay, look deeper.
Exactly. Don't just get lost in the action. Focus on the guy Hutch Mansell.
Right. And the analysis quickly sketches out who he is at the beginning. This overlooked suburban dad living a really monotonous, quiet, almost invisible life.
Invisible is the key word. Then the break-in happens. That's the catalyst.
Yeah, but the source emphasizes it's not just about starting the plot, is it?
No, not at all. It triggers something inside Hutch, something profound. The analysis really highlights his journey from that, dull quietness to becoming this awakened lethal force.
And it frames his rampage because it is a rampage not just as revenge or reaction.
Right. It's framed explicitly as a way of revealing his buried past, his hidden self.
So the action isn't just driving the character.
No, the source argues the action is the result. It's the expression of his internal state, his history.
It's Hutch changing, and the violence is how he speaks that change.
Precisely. The blood, the chaos.
Yeah.
It's like a window into his psychology, according to this analysis.
And that focus on character leads right into the main themes the source pulls out. Kicking us off is identity and repression. How does the source describe Hutch there?
Well, it presents him as almost this walking symbol of a certain kind of modern feeling, and calls it the emasculated modern man.
Emasculated.
Yeah, buried under routine, under what society expects, restraint. His real skills, his past, are totally hidden. So his explosion, his violence. The source sees it as more than just fighting back. It's about reclaiming agency.
Agency he lost somewhere along the way.
Exactly, a reaction to feeling suppressed emotionally, feeling completely dismissed. Invisible.
That interpretation, the emasculated modern man, that seems to connect directly to another big theme the source tackles, masculinity in crisis.
Absolutely. The analysis points out how the film kind of cleverly does both things. It satirizes and embraces that old trope, the quiet man pushed too far.
Right, we've seen that before.
But it doesn't just leave it there. It asks this really important question about the line the film walks.
Yeah.
That blurry line between honor, maybe protecting his family, and just bloodlust, between being a protector and being a predator.
So it's not painting him as a straightforward hero?
Not according to this analysis, no.
Yeah.
It's more complex. It's looking at the darker stuff, the societal pressures that might be driving him.
And that complexity brings us to something I found really, really interesting in the analysis. Violence as catharsis. Because the source argues Hutch doesn't just return to violence because he has to after the break-in. It suggests he finds it again out of, desire.
Yes. This is where it gets really fascinating. The source argues that the action sequences, the brutality, the almost over-the-top nature of it, it's not just spectacle, it's a metaphor.
A metaphor for what?
For freedom.
Yeah.
For purpose.
Yeah.
And crucially, for emotional release. The argument is that the violence is Hutch finally externalizing everything he's kept bottled up. It's how he finally feels potent, capable, real, when his normal suburban life just wasn't giving him that.
So it's like therapy with fists and guns.
Kind of, yeah. Twisted therapy, maybe. Delivered with bullets and broken bones. But therapy nonetheless, in the logic of the film presented here.
That's such a different way to look at action scenes. It connects the physical stuff directly to his psychological need. It gives the violence actual character meaning.
And if you connect that to the bigger picture the source is painting, it's saying the brutality is largely symbolic. It's the visible sign of Hutch shedding that boring suburban skin and embracing the guy he used to be, the one he thought he'd buried.
Which ties back perfectly to that theme of the suburban facade.
Exactly. The analysis highlights that contrast. The quiet, often gray, dull suburban world versus the inner chaos and the explosion that follows.
The difference between how things look and the violent truth underneath, that's key here, isn't it?
That dissonance is central to the analysis, yeah. Appearance versus reality.
And the analysis doesn't just talk themes, it really digs into the film's visuals, the symbolism, the motifs. What does the source point out as important visually?
It calls out a few specific things. First, there's the watch.
His old watch.
Yeah. When he digs that out and puts it on, the analysis reads it as a really powerful symbol. It's like he's reactivating his old identity. It's a literal ticking reminder of the professional killer he was before the suburbs kind of swallowed him up.
Okay, so the watch signal is bringing the past back into the present. Makes sense. What else?
Then there's the basement and the hidden rooms in his house.
Right, the safe room kind of thing.
Yeah. According to this analysis, those spaces represent his repressed memories, his hidden self. His dangerous past isn't gone, it's just hidden away, built into the architecture of his normal life, waiting. And finally, the source highlights the color palette. It notes a real shift.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Early scenes are all dull neutrals, grays, beiges, washed-out colors. The analysis calls it visual shorthand for his boredom, his detachment.
Okay.
But once he starts to, become nobody again, and the action kicks off, the palette shifts dramatically. Stark reds, bright yellows. The source interprets that as expressing rage, vitality, the release of his true self. It's like the color comes back into his world along with the violence.
Wow, so the colors aren't just random choices. This analysis says they're actually mapping his emotional journey, moving from nobody in a dull world to someone violently alive in a world of intense color.
That's the argument, that these filmmaking choices are deliberate. They reinforce the themes. The watch isn't just a prop. The house layout isn't accidental. The colors track his psychology. It's all about looking beneath the surface.
Which makes sense given the focus on character. The source also uses archetypes to frame Hutch's journey. At the start, it calls him the invisible man.
Yeah, the forgotten husband, the overlooked father, ignored by his family, dismissed by strangers, like a ghost in his own life. He is the nobody of the title, literally.
And that invisibility connects to another trope the source brings up, the beast within.
Right. The analysis links nobody to other films where this inner, often violent side breaks out. It mentions things like Fight Club or Falling Down.
Okay, I can see the parallels.
But the source makes a really crucial distinction here for understanding Hutch. It argues it's not a separate identity emerging, like a Tyler Durden.
So not a split personality.
No, it's presented as a reintegration, a bringing back together of a buried part of himself. The quiet dad and the lethal killer aren't two different people, they're two parts of the same whole. And the film, in this reading, is about those parts merging, however violently.
That's a really vital point. It's about him allowing his whole self, the dangerous past and the present domestic life to coexist.
Exactly. And the source even extends this idea to Hutch's house itself.
The house.
It calls the house a symbol of domesticity, of his current identity. And when it transforms into this chaotic battleground.
Right, the big finale.
Symbolically, that reflects Hutch merging his old self with his current reality. He literally brings the fight home, integrating those two halves of his identity. Destructively, yes, but reintegratively within the film's logic.
Okay, let's talk style. The source discusses the film's visual approach, calling it hyper-reality, not traditional surrealism.
Yeah, it points to the exaggerated violence, bodies flying, people surviving insane injuries, the action almost like choreography.
Very stylized.
And the source interprets that stylized brutality as symbolic. It argues the film isn't really interested in realistic pain. Instead, the over-the-top violence becomes a form of self-expression for Hutch. It pushes into satire, almost comic book fantasy territory.
So it's intentionally unrealistic.
That's the idea. The source argues the film has one foot in gritty reality, the mundane suburban details, and the other in this heightened, unbelievable fantasy of the action scenes.
And that blend allows the violence to be symbolic.
Exactly. Less about literal damage, more a visual language for Hutch's suppressed power and identity finally breaking free.
Pulling back a bit, the source also finds elements of social commentary. It links Hutch's initial state to middle-class ennui.
Yeah, that feeling of stagnation, lack of fulfillment in a conventional life. And it also connected to ideas around toxic masculinity.
How so?
Well, the analysis argues that while the film presents Hutch's explosion as cathartic for him, it's also kind of disturbing if you look at it critically. The source suggests it points to maybe a cultural inability to process emotion without destruction.
That's a strong critique.
It suggests it's a critique of societal pressures, maybe particularly on men, pushing them towards violent outlets when other forms of expression feel blocked or unavailable.
And that links right into the idea of perceived weakness and social value the source brings up.
Definitely. Hutch is initially mocked, right? Even by his own son for not fighting back during the break-in. He's seen as weak because he wasn't violent.
Yeah, I remember that scene.
So the source sees his whole violent journey as, in part, a way to reclaim social worth, to prove his value through aggression.
Which raises a big question, doesn't it? The source seems to ask if the film, maybe satirically, is commenting on how masculinity gets falsely tied to aggression, dominance.
Exactly. If you connect all these dots, the analysis suggests nobody, through its hyperviolence, might actually be critiquing how society values men and the very limited, often destructive ways they're sometimes allowed to express strength or deep feelings.
Violence becomes this distorted path to getting back status and identity.
In this hyper-real world, yeah.
Now, to give everyone listening some context, the source material lists some similar films just to see where it places. Nobody.
Right, it throws out a few comparisons.
Like John Wick, obviously. That's the big one for the retired killer trope.
Yeah, but also A History of Violence, The Hidden Past, Disrupting Domestic Life.
Okay.
Falling Down, Fight Club for that beast within, societal frustration angle. The Equalizer, The Quiet Guy delivering brutal justice, Taxi Driver even for the psychological dissent, and the Korean thriller The Man from Nowhere.
That's a good list. It helps situate it.
And seeing those comparisons helps clarify what this analysis sees as nobody's specific angle. As it says in its final thoughts, it's not just like these films. It's positioned specifically as a satirical riff on the male power fantasy.
A satirical riff, so it's playing with the tropes, but also maybe critiquing them through exaggeration.
That seems to be the core argument, yeah. Using the style and the focus on Hutch's psychology to hold those power fantasies up for a closer look.
Okay, so let's pull it all together. After this deep dive into the source material, what's the big takeaway?
Well, this analysis makes a really strong case that nobody is doing much more than just being a fun action movie with Bob Odenkirk surprising everyone.
Right.
It presents it as a genuinely thoughtful, layered look at some pretty complex stuff. Identity, repression, those tricky societal expectations around masculinity.
And using that highly stylized, almost symbolic violence as its main way of talking about these things.
Exactly. The source's final assessment is actually pretty glowing. It calls the film a thoughtful, blood-spattered character study with surprising emotional undertones.
High praise.
Yeah, and it backed it up with a strong rating, like an 8.5 out of 10 or 4 stars. It gives a lot of credit to Odenkirk's performance for balancing the vulnerability with the action.
Which you'd need for the character study part to work, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
The source argues that's essential. It sees the film as pulling off this trick, being a crowd pleaser, and offering this subtle critique of the very things it's showing.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. The source material definitely offers a really interesting lens for looking at nobody, gives you something new to think about if you rewatch it.
And speaking of things to think about, here's something to maybe mull over, building on what the source suggests. If societal roles, these expectations, can feel so stifling that they push someone like Hutch down this extreme path, this violent catharsis, just to reclaim identity, are there other ways? Other, non-destructive ways for people feeling those pressures to find validation, find purpose, express their whole complex selves. What does it say about our culture, maybe, if unleashing the beast within through violence is presented, even satirically, even hyper-really, as a form of release, as catharsis?
That's a heavy question to end on, something for you to definitely think about. Until next time, keep diving deep.